behalf of the Los Angeles Review of Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to Writing Toward Liberation with Jody Armour, Bidhan Chandra Roy, and Maytha Alhassen. Three incredible scholars and activists. We're really excited and honored to have joined us this evening for this important discussion of writing, language, and the prison industrial complex. I'm Irene Yoon, Executive Director of the Los Angeles Review of Books and Director of the LARB Publishing Workshop. So as many of you may know, all the donations for this evening's event go to scholarship funding for our workshop students. The Publishing Workshop is an intensive summer course dedicated to helping young people from diverse backgrounds gain access to the world of publishing, regardless of their ability to pay. The belief that drives the program is at its core the same as that which animates tonight's conversation, namely that the written word has the power to shape and change society and the systems it supports. So I really want to extend our heartfelt thanks to those of you who made contributions, and really to all of you who've made the time to join us here tonight, technological difficulties notwithstanding. After about 45 minutes or so of discussion between our three speakers, we'll transition to Q&A with the audience. We invite you to submit any questions in the Zoom Q&A window or the YouTube live chat, depending on how you're joining us tonight. And without further ado, I'm honored to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dr. Maytha Alhassen. Maytha Alhassen is a historian, journalist, poet, organizer, and mending practitioner. As a journalist, she's worked as an on-air host on Al Jazeera and the Young Turks, and has done field reporting for a variety of outlets, including CNN and the Huffington Post. She has co-founded multiple social justice organizations and currently is Associate Professor in Social Justice and Community Organizing at Prescott College. If that weren't enough to keep one incredibly busy, Dr. Alhassen also writes for the Hulu series Rami and offers yoga, meditation, and Reiki workshops. We're so grateful to have her join us and guide this evening's conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Maytha. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I know I'm so LA. I am originally from here, from Tongva land. I am really thrilled to do something with these illustrious panelists and with the Los Angeles Review of Books. I've been a longtime reader and supporter, so I'm thrilled to be here. As I said, standing in Tongva land, in a land of sundown towns all the way up to the late 1960s, in a town where the largest massacre of Chinese folks on US soil happened. So let's keep those things in mind as we think about abolition, reparation, and justice. I'm going to introduce our panelists tonight. You probably already know them, but of course, want to give you that context. Jody David Armour is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at USC. He's been a member of faculty since 1995. Doesn't look that way. His expertise ranges from personal injury claims to claims about the relationship between racial justice, criminal justice, and the rule of law. Armour studies the intersection of race and legal decision-making, as well as torts and tort reform movements. I want to hear about that. I want to see how the intersections around torts and race. A widely published scholar and popular lecturer, Armour is a Soros Justice Senior Fellow of the Open Society Institute Center for Crime, Communities, and Culture. His book, Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, The Hidden Costs of Being Black in America, addresses three core concerns of the BLM movement, namely racial profiling, police brutality, and mass incarceration. His most recent book, N-Word Theory, thank you for making us all feel uncomfortable for that, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law, which is coming out with Los Angeles Review of Books, examines law, language, and moral luck in the criminal justice system. His work on the intersection of these topics grew into a unique interdisciplinary and multimedia analysis of social justice and linguistics titled Race, Rap, and Redemption, which was produced at USC or by USC alumni and featuring performances by Ice Cube, Maya Del Valle, Saul Williams, Lula Washington Dance Theater, Macy Gray Music Academy Orchestra, and Mylon Rivera. So a lot going on. I can't wait to engage. Bidhan Chandra Roy is a professor of English literature at Cal State LA, where he has taught for the past 13 years, trained in post-colonial studies. Bidhan received his PhD from Goldsmiths College, University of London. Bidhan's current research and teaching focuses upon a critical pedagogical approach to community engagement in the humanities. I love me some critical pedagogy, so excited to delve into that. He's the founder of WordsUncaged, a platform for incarcerated artists and writers to engage with the public through book publishing, art exhibits, and digital media. Bidhan is also currently the faculty director of the first in-prison degree program at LA County Prison, Lancaster, and researches new pedagogical approaches to teaching in prison. He has been teaching in prison since 2004 and is a passionate advocate for prison reform in California. He currently serves on the board of the California Humanities and rapper YG's Foundation, 400 Ways. He is currently co-authoring a book about the development of WordsUncaged as a platform for prison reform with former life without parole prisoner Tobias Tubbs. Bidhan's proudest achievement is that of the 67 life without possibility of parole folks, they have commuted their sentences by Governor Jerry Brown. 20% had participated in the WordsUncaged program while in prison and had support letters written on their behalf by the organization. So collectively, there is so much of a profound set of knowledge, both theoretical and experiential, and also artistic. We have a lot to get into. One question off top, how did you get into this work? What is the journey you took to engage academia with social justice within the prison industrial complex? Jody? Dr. Armour, I should say.
Yes, Maytha. Okay, sure. Thank you very much. And yeah, I was introduced to the wonders of the law as an 8-year-old when I got a Breonna Taylor kind of rude raid in our family home. My 7 siblings and I were lined up in a room, huddled, phalanx of cops around my handcuffed and prostrate dad. And I didn't see him upright again until I was visiting him in the Ohio State Penitentiary on Family Day, where he was sentenced to 22 to 55 years for possession and sale of marijuana. And in his situation, in the predicament he found himself in, he was going to rot in that jail cell because he was one of them uppity Negroes that was going to get no good time and do all 55, you know, if he made it there, which, you know. So it was either that, rotting in that cage, or what he reached for instead, and it worked out for him. He started grabbing law books from the warden's library shelves, taught himself constitutional law, criminal procedure, exhausted the warden's stash of books, got the students at Ohio State Law School to start bringing him in books, and then started writing his own writs of habeas corpus on his cell floor with this typewriter right here. I'll show you the typewriter he used right there, that Royal Manual typewriter on his cell floor, kind of tapping out his own salvation, you know, deep into the night. And I stood, the next time I was standing next to him in public, I was a 14-year-old, he was in Cincinnati in 6th Circuit Court of Appeals, arguing before an en banc panel of judges literally for his life. And you know, Cincinnati is where the Underground Railroad came up in the antebellum South, right? When you go to Cincinnati, you fly into Cincinnati, you actually land in Kentucky. Then you gotta drive over the river into Cincinnati, right? That's the Underground Railroad. That's where black bodies in bondage found deliverance, right? In the antebellum South. Well, here was another black body in bondage, my dad, you know, in Cincinnati, before this en banc panel of judges in the 6th Circuit, arguing literally, like I said, for his life, and he's prevailed in his case, Armour versus Salisbury. And so I learned from him, and I teach his case in my criminal law class now, I learned from him the power of language. All he had was word work. All he had was words that he could put together in a certain order And the next thing you knew, he had the door to his jailhouse cell flying open. So that's where I kind of developed an appreciation for what Toni Morrison means when she says, words are not just entertainment, words are acts with consequences. And that's just how I think about it now from that experience.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about it as word work, which is so powerful, especially considering this theme of writing towards liberation. And you literally showed us an artifact from that work, from your lineage, from your father. So thank you for that. So many questions. Hopefully we can get into. Bidhan, how did you find your way into this work?
Well, I have a lot less dramatic story, I'm afraid, than Jody. But I was a volunteer initially in 2003 or 4, and I was on the board of a pit bull rescue service, and we started a program in a prison, which was the first at the time dog program. So dogs that were going to be killed, we took them into the prison. There was a whole kind of training process, and as part of that, I started these writing classes around our participants reflected upon their experience of being in this program. And at that time, life without parole really meant life without parole. So we had men in our program that had been in prison, incarcerated for 40 plus years. And what was just so moving to me was, I remember this one chap that just touched the dog for the first time in 40 something years. And it was like a convulsion on his body, just the experience of touching a sentient being that wasn't in a violent way or anything like that, just that act itself, a really simple act. And so the idea of trying to put language to that and to express it, because I sort of felt at that time, if people could have the experience I was having, that wasn't an expert on prison, I didn't have the experience that Jody had, that same kind of personal connection. And I felt like if people could have the experience I was having in there and recognize who you are locking up and literally just letting, the death penalty by incarceration, that you couldn't have a system like this. It blew my mind. You can hear I'm from Europe originally, from London, and I didn't really know what life without parole meant, because I couldn't quite, a life sentence in Europe means something different. It's not actually your whole life. So it took me quite a while to really understand that. And I thought, how can we have this? And how can myself, that's a naturalized citizen and a taxpayer now, that even though I didn't know about this system before, I was supporting it through my ignorance. So the writing became a way of kind of trying to create a platform for those voices to get out there and to kind of hopefully make something that to me was intolerable to others.
Yeah, any encounter with the prison system, it's remarkable that anybody would walk away and say that this is anything that's rehabilitative. This is anything that has a positive impact on anybody socially.
That's right.
So a question that we've been thinking about, especially with the rise of BLM, defund the police movement, has been this interesting conversation. Jody brought up the Underground Railroad. There's this revival of a notion of abolition. And before, we were talking about, Bidhan and I earlier, in the early aughts, in the 2000s, prison abolition was a lingo and a phrase. And now the prison part has been dropped off because people are seeing things not just as a prison industrial complex, but in conversation with other systems. So for folks like you two who have been doing this work for a while, with that BLM defund movement and abolition and this rising sort of celebrity culture, this abiding DTJ, I won't say his name, administration that tried to not pioneer, but create a name for itself doing criminal justice reform. How do you define those two spaces, the prison reform movement and the abolition movement? And where do you see your work landing? So whoever wants to jump in.
You can go first, Bidhan.
Okay. Well, it's a really tricky I'm conflicted with it because I'm not a prison reformist, but I find myself at the moment kind of operating within the prison quite a lot that I'm not sure how we get to abolition. That's not necessarily something I'm the person to really speak on, but ethically, I can say this, that I'm an abolitionist in the sense of that I don't think prisons work and we need something completely different. And then from where I am now, one of the kind of things why, you know, a kind of discourse of reform can be useful is it offers people like me a way into the prison system to be able to work within there. Because one of the kind of challenges I've always thought of is, how do you enable the voices from inside to be able to speak for themselves about these issues? And without someone actually going in there, I'm not sure how those voices get out. And so it becomes a kind of discourse that only is spoken about on others' behalf. Now, I think that's needed too, but my own personal point is working inside a prison, which brings up all these ethical issues, because I mean, there is a kind of a compromise on your own ethnics just to step inside a prison, you know, and so I find myself in a kind of complicated space between really being an abolitionist and believing and trying to walk towards that, and you know, as the title of this talk, you know, this kind of idea of toward liberation. But how do you start somewhere at this moment and include those people who it's affected in you know, inside of prison, to enable their voices to speak for themselves, as because I think they offer some of the best solutions. We're writing a book right now called Imagine a World Without Prisons, which is a kind of book on prison abolition by people with life without parole sentences from an imaginative space, as a way of kind of trying to imagine something that for most people in America, prison abolition is like impossible to even conceive, because it's, you know, as Foucault and others have written about, it's so like embedded in every little bit of our culture that just bringing that up can kind of throw people off. So I'm not exactly sure where I fit in it in this historical moment, because to some prison abolitionists, just the fact that I go into prison and run a program in there makes me compromised. And that's like, you know, I don't know, it's just a complicated issue that that I'm not sure exactly how to best express that, but you know, I find myself in that space between, I guess.
Yeah, I'm pretty much an unapologetic both police and prison abolitionist, all the way. And I say it in the same way that I'm an unapologetic champion of defunding the police and support defunding the police as political messaging by the activists who have embraced it and been criticized by many of us who tone police them and tell them, don't say defund the police, don't say defund the police, you know, that's triggering, you know, say something else. Since we're talking so much about writing and language, right? So these activists who have been able to bring about the most successful social movement of our generation need to be lectured on political communication strategies by some people who were saying a lot of the same stuff when they were first saying Black Lives Matter. I remember vividly, Black Lives Matter. Oh, Black Lives Matter. No, all lives matter. Why do you just Black Lives Matter? Why you got to say something so divisive, right? That's all you heard. I remember early on. And then a little after that, about a year later, all of a sudden I hear people saying Blue Lives Matter. Oh, so you always got it. You always understood what we were saying. You were just being a a-hole. Okay, I got you now. So, you know, the tone policing, you know, when activists say, you know, abolish prisons, abolish the police, they don't mean overnight. Who most that I'm talking to, who are you talking to who's saying that? Who's saying only Black Lives Matter? Who's saying that? Right? A lot of people are stuffing straw men just to knock them down. That's what they're doing. But what we're saying is, when we're talking about, for example, police abolition is defund the police. Only 5% of their time is spent responding to any kind of activities or transactions having anything to do with violence. So there's a big bloated punishment bureaucracy that we have both at the front end and back end with the police and the prison system. Let's start taking care of the front end first, that part of the bloated punishment bureaucracy, by shrinking it, defunding it, and reinvesting in programs that can really promote safety in the community by lifting people out of criminogenic conditions that foreseeably lead to crime, right? So we're overall much safer by investing at the front end rather than now let's go to the back end, the other part of abolition, dumping our social failures in jail cells and prisons and making them the receptacles of our social failures, as we started to do through the Clinton years. While Clinton was taking the scissors to the social safety net that FDR put in place, welfare as we know it, he was also increasing jails and police, right? And more jails, more prison, more police, making it real clear that there was a connection between the two. We're pulling back support for social services and going to replace them with police, prisons, and jails, right? So just the recognition that the abolition at the back end, that a lot of times the reason we have bloated prisons is because people are trapped in criminogenic conditions. Let's do something about the crumbling schools, the lack of jobs, the lack of affordable housing, the lack of health care. Let's do something about those criminogenic conditions, and we'll find that the crime goes way down. Then let's get rid of all the broken windows policing crap that we've been doing. There's just some studies out showing that when you break down on misdemeanor crime, it actually increases crime, right? I got some recent studies I was looking at, right? I'll be glad to share those, showing that the whole broken windows approach to policing that we've been engaging in for the last 30 years was wrong-headed and counterproductive. So, we can abolish prisons at the back end by taking those kind of maneuvers. And then one final thing, when we stop thinking about prisoners themselves, even violent ones, as so much toxic human waste to be dumped and forgotten, as monsters, as others, as demons, as what I call in my book, the way we niggerize, particularly violent Black criminals, Willie Horton being a prime example of how that violent Black criminals shape the public narrative about crime and punishment and make us a more punitive nation.
Oh my God, so much in what you're saying. I know we had an exchange on Twitter, was it over a year ago or a couple months after the uprisings and the extreme pushback about the defund the police messaging? For me, it was very clear that if you can't say defund the police now, you probably, when slavery was happening, when people had chains on their legs and were having their babies ripped from their arms, you probably would not say end slavery, right? So we have, not that everything is analogous and that there isn't historical contingencies that make things different, but the kind of resistance to systemic change around state violence is something we need to interrogate. And then something else you said, Jody, just also reminded me that we don't have a language around the acceptable violence that we will absorb from the state, right? Like, it's very violent for the state to put people in conditions where a large majority of children are hungry every single day in this country, where there are open abandoned houses and there are people that are being raided from Echo Park right now for creating their own tents because there's nothing left to live in. And so that kind of violence, for some reason, we cannot comprehend that as tangible. But what we go to is, like, as you said, the 5% that we imagine the police protecting us from, but there is no protection when they come after the fact to the scene of a crime. And so I think it's really important, and these are the conversations I've been having with BLM folks, was for them to make the connection around that prison abolition and defund, because people saw them as separate. And this is kind of the work that DTJ was doing, which he was saying, I am the criminal justice reformer, but Blue Lives Matter, I'm going to empower the police. We love the police. And people did not see that as cognitive dissonance when it should be.
Give you one quick example. Think about just the fact, and I'm going to be in and out of this in 60 seconds or less. Think about the fact that we have dispensaries all around here in Westchester, fancy dispensaries, weed dispensaries. You go in now, and it's like going in an emporium, and it is just so inviting and welcoming and cush, right? In every sense of the word. And just a couple years ago, we're locking people up. We're locking them up. Obama sent Eric Holder out here in 2010 to fight against marijuana legalization. It's been bipartisan. This mass incarceration, racialized mass incarceration, has been a bipartisan affair, and all racial groups have participated in it. Obama, as a black man, sent another black man, Eric Holder, out here to fight against legalizing a drug that is no worse than alcohol. We know, number one, and whose enforcement, the measures that were taken to enforce against it were grossly disproportionately, falling on the Black community. And so we couldn't even get our act together then. So yeah, we have a lot of soul searching to do, and I'm just hoping that in conversations like this we can do it.
Yeah. So many dynamics of very Frankenstein sort of thinking and action that we still have to, I think we're going to take decades to come back and have a retrospective around unpacking a lot of this stuff. I want to go into a little bit more detail, Bidhan, around the work of prison education. As we were saying, some folks who are hardcore abolitionists will say that's strengthening the prison system. So why would we go in there and say we have a service when we would want to try to get people out and say, no, they have a service waiting for them on the outside. Let's try getting them out. What have you seen happen within the prison education work that you've done? And of course, Jody, jump in. I know that you worked also alongside folks who do this work as well. And I'm sure you've gone in and done some work yourself. I'd like to hear more.
Yeah, it's, I mean, I agree with everything Jody said. But I do, and this is why I understand why people are kind of critical of people that work in prison education, because I do feel a little compromised by it, because at any moment you can have your, it's called a, green card, your prison ID, that I have like a staff card to be able to enter the prison. In order to run all these programs, and at any moment, without any reasons whatsoever or due process or anything, they can take that card away from you, and then your work in there is done. So there's a kind of fragility to that position that which makes me a little sometimes cautious about talking about certain things. And I as I say, I do feel kind of compromised sometimes by it, but I weigh that up against the other bit of it, which, one of the things that I've kind of thought about with this is not too long ago, CDCR added the R. It was just the Department of Corrections, and then they add in the rehabilitation bit at the end, the R. But obviously for most people, that R is, it doesn't really mean anything, but it gives you a space to co-opt something that's kind of been wired into the system itself. And how do you then go into that, use that as a little window to go in? And, it's not a very good metaphor right now in a pandemic, but I kind of see it like a contagion, that you can be like a disease of education and liberation that goes in and offers these kind of spaces, and that can work through the system or undo the system from the people that are suffering at the hands of it, by giving them tools and giving them opportunities and giving them spaces and platforms for their voices to get out. So that's kind of been my thinking, and that's the model around education. And then on the kind of, not so much the big picture, but just the kind of personal level, as you sort of become, I guess, emotionally invested in the people that you're working with, many whom had life without parole, seeing them get out of prison is like pretty amazing. And that they become advocates on the outside. And I think part of the kind of alternative model that I think Jody was referring to instead of police and punishment in this kind of system, to be able to create enable people to see something different based upon a kind of, you know, I guess restorative justice might come close to it, but I'm not exactly talking about that, but something along those lines, and say, here are people that have been called super predators, you know, that often have committed violent crimes at some point, but really are the assets that can heal the community that they once harmed. And that, I think, is the kind of key component, is there's no sugarcoating the fact that there's harm being done, but understanding that harm in this binary way of like, there's a perpetrator of it and there's an innocent victim is just not factually true, because most of the people that end up in prison have experienced crime, experienced abuse, experienced all that, and then at some point they've done it themselves. But it's not like they're the bad, you know, in this kind of binary bad guy, good guy. It's just, once you kind of spend a lot of time in that context, you realize that's a completely false myth. And so if you can see it more in terms, depersonalized, and more in terms of like, harm has been caused, no doubt about it, but that harm has been passed down, you know, all the way from the history of this country to the very events that were mentioned earlier. How do you transform that in another way, and how do you respond to it in another way? And, you know, I've found that those people that have got out of prison from really long sentences are the best advocates in a way for it, because people can see embodied, man, I should be scared of that guy from how he's represented in every other facet of our culture. And here's this powerful, articulate man. We're only in the man's prison, so I say man, that can have this impact in their community and can speak to kids in a way that I certainly can't, because they've seen it through this lived experience that's also been theorized. And they're the people that can, you know, a lot of the people in our program they have their own theories, not just like thoughts, but actual theories that are just as valid as academic theories. And so I feel like allowing that space to come is really what I see the goal of education, and this kind of, those that have suffered the most and been most oppressed can be the architects and the voice of this kind of journey toward liberation.
Yeah, I really leap to agree. I had a similar experience when I take my students up to San Quentin, for example, and we sit down with a program called No More Tears. I went up there with Layla Steinberg, who's been doing it for well over 20, 30 years, maybe 30 years. Went up there with Tupac when he performed in the Yard back in the day. And so we sit down, just as an example of, I think, the importance of having some interaction between folks in prison and folks who are outside the walls of the prison, but are going to make important policy decisions about what happens to people inside those walls. And my students, my law students, are those kinds of people. They're going to be judges, DAs, defense attorneys, public defenders, all the rest. So we go in there, we sit down, and No More Tears, for example, I think is a prime example of the power that of some of these interactions and programs. We'll have, as part of the program, you'll have mothers of murder victims and lifers, men sentenced to life without parole. San Quentin's a men's prison too. And a typical session would go something like this. One of the mothers of a murder victim would stand up and describe her loved one that she lost, and what the loss of that loved one did to the family, how it devastated the family. You know, ripped a big hole in the family of fabric. And then we'll pass pictures or anything. We have mementos around if she has them. And, you know, as she talks about her loved one that was lost by people like those in the room with us, right? And then she would sit down, and then one of the life without parole men would stand up, and let's say he had 10 minutes. He'd spend the first 5 minutes talking about the person whose death he caused. You know, if you had any background on him, any pictures, the family that he had devastated with his violent act. right? That'll be the first 5 minutes. And he would often say something like, at the end of that, something like, I'll paraphrase, the person who did that act, who deprived that family of that loved one, who hurt that victim, was a depraved individual. Then for the last 5 minutes, they'll say, let me tell you how I got to be that depraved individual. And a lot of times they'll go into a story that's sordid beyond belief. Often they're in a foster care situation, talking about being thrown in car trunks as a 3-year-old for 2 and 3 hours at a time, as discipline, cigarette burns, molestation. You go down the line and you kind of start to really see, after we already sat with the mothers of murder victims, and we all sat with them for a while before any Lifers Without Parole stood up. But after we sat with them, then now we sit with the story that he just told us, and it really strikes home in a way that is more visceral than you can imagine, that hurt people hurt people. The line between victims and victimizers becomes much more porous than my students started out thinking, and they come away from those experiences almost to a person, saying how transformative they found it to be, to go in those places and put a human face on people that they'd otherwise monsterized, demonized, or as I say in my work, niggerized.
Yeah. I was just sitting and thinking about, it's great you use this term transformative, because that's been a movement that's responded to how limiting restorative justice as a court-ordered initiative that still involves, as you said, the victor and offender model. So folks within a community from a grassroots sense developed this framework of transformative justice, looking at the systems that reproduce violence and how you can disrupt it through harm reduction, and what the testimony, as you were beautifully illustrating to us, does when you put folks in conversation. I've been in transformative justice experiences before. It's still something that's kind of new that we're still trying to work out as a diversion from the legal system, but hopefully eventually the folks that you have brought in can have the power to say, do this instead. Let's involve the community and let's think very inventively around how to use the law. A quick question, Jody, and I want to get to something with you, a closing question for both of you. My father told me this. I don't know if this is accurate, but apparently there was a shift around how you could take the bar before, because now you have to either go through law school or get an apprenticeship with a lawyer who vouches for you, because incarcerated folks in California were studying for the bar on their own and passing. And so they wanted that as a deterrent. Do you know anything about this?
I don't know, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. I could easily have slipped by, and I will definitely look into it now. And I certainly wouldn't put it past folks, because people have an irrational fear of people who've been convicted of crimes.
Yeah.
Felons, especially if it's been a violent crime. So I'll look into it, Maytha.
Yeah. I mean, I think it kind of combines all the things we were talking about, which is like, what does it mean to really be an autodidact and to have a critical pedagogy of training yourself towards justice? So a closing question, I'm using my moderator privileges to extend my question asking, and then we're going to bring your questions in, folks who are listening. Bidhan, can you talk about the work that's come out of Words Uncaged? In your bio, you mentioned that folks who are life without prison, life without parole, have gone through your program and have had sentences commuted. And you mentioned it a little bit, that folks were doing advocating on the outside as well.
Yeah. So when I first started, we because as I say, life without parole meant that we weren't really anticipating this second iteration that's been a really kind of happy surprise. And so we developed this thing, and I don't like to kind of own it in any way because we all did it collaboratively. But the idea was to have, to kind of show, again, not exactly restorative justice, but like transformative justice, this idea that the person that caused the harm can be the person that can bring healing. We did this interview recently with the head of parole, and she was saying that one of the things that she's very happy this change in terms of trying to reduce sentencing and let more people out and all this kind of thing. But the downside for her was the court dates re-traumatize the survivor of the crime or the families, because there's no healing built into the system of punitive justice. And I think the thing with punitive justice is people think somehow that's what they're supposed to do, or they're not being faithful or loyal to their loved one that may have died or been, you know, whatever happened to, if they don't come out with this hardline punitive system. But then 30, 40 years later, they realize they haven't healed from it. And so there's this kind of weird, and I think that's part of, you know, what Jody was mentioning about this irrational fear and animus towards people that have committed a violent crime. So we took that idea and said, well, how can we create something when people with life without parole get out, that we do something in the community that's a storytelling based project that helps the young people that were basically on their path, to have those people that have gone through that path speak to them and do this kind of collaborative storytelling project. So one of the new things we're doing with this, once the pandemic eases a bit, is it's a pilot program for, it's kind of like a diversion program as part of the shutting down the juvenile prisons in LA. And it's run by former lifers. And we do this kind of collaborative storytelling project where this event, someone will tell their story of you know, let's say a gang murder in the third person, but tell the actual story. And then everyone in the community can write that story in whatever way. They can rewrite it, they can connect to emotions or whatever. And so it becomes this kind of collective project of telling this story as this big kind of tapestry that hopefully can be a way that people can feel heard and heal as well. Because I think that's another missing part in just punitive justice, is it's like, and a narrow definition of the law is that there is harm caused, but just locking someone up doesn't, it just makes it worse for everyone. And so that's the kind of idea of a kind of social transformation, by recognizing that idea that healing can happen, and it can happen through this kind of collaborative storytelling process.
Let me just throw this in real quick. Let me bounce off of that for 5 seconds with this. I hear everything you say, and you know I agree with everything. But here is the counter thing that I hear sometimes, especially from those of us who are on the left, who are progressives otherwise, typically otherwise progressives. When someone from a socially marginalized community is injured, well, you know, your LGBTQ member, Black person, woman, you know, a lot of times we start saying the only way you can show that you care for those victims from those socially marginalized groups is by punishing the victimizer, especially if they're from a dominant group, right? And giving no quarter, not showing. And for example, I think, you know, I'm thinking of Amber Geiger and Botham John, the Dallas white woman, Dallas police officer who shot the Black young man, 26, eating ice cream on his couch, watching TV. Everyone on my timeline was saying, murder, murder, murder. She should get murdered. Now, she made a dumb mistake. She was clearly negligent. She got off on the wrong floor, mistook his apartment for hers. The door was ajar. He thought she kicked it open, thought he was an intruder. Stupid mistake, negligence, right? No question, recklessness. Typically, that's manslaughter, folks. But everybody on my timeline was saying murder, murder, murder. If we can't find it in our, and I think, you know, and otherwise, these were anti-incarceration people. They were otherwise decarceration people, you know, when it came to other general crimes. But wait, when the victim is from a marginalized group, a Black man, and the victimizer, a white police officer, you know, I don't want to even talk about nothing to talk about here, murder. But, you know, let's be as punitive as possible in our response to show we care for those people. No, and so I lost followers and friends behind saying, you know, we're never going to get out of mass incarceration with that attitude, folks. We got to start rethinking violent offenders like all the way across the board. We can't pick and choose.
Well, it's not even just mass incarceration, it's incarceration in general, right? A similar conversation, if we're talking about language, arose in response to what happened on Capitol Hill on January 6th, folks quickly from marginalized groups who said, if we were those folks that came in, we would have been killed. Let's call them domestic terrorists. But there was a pushback from the Muslim community, specifically even Black Muslim community. This is where there was an interesting divide. There's a Black Muslim community, then there was the non-Muslim Black community. But anybody that was in the Muslim community said, pump the brakes.
Yes.
Be using that language of the state, that it only existed as a form of incarceration, of discipline, of stripping rights, of stripping agency, will only strengthen that field of counterterrorism. And so what does it mean for us to say what this is without using the language of state violence?
Yes, that's beautiful. You couldn't make a better, I remember that vividly. If we start saying, allowing them to call domestic terrorists what those people did in DC, which many of us loathe and abominate, right? But if we allow them to characterize them as domestic terrorists, I'm gonna be honest with you. Over the summer, I was commenting every day for 6 weeks here in LA while the streets were roiling with protesters and activists, and it was there were times when it was turning violent, right? And I had heard a lot of people trying to characterize them as terrorists. And I kept saying, no, 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 don't characterize them as terrorists, even though there was a lot of violence and there was looting and there was a lot of other stuff going on. And I could have easily characterized a lot of those activities that way if I wanted to start going down that road. You don't want to start going down that road. You know, the FBI is already calling people like me Black identity extremists just being associated with Black Lives Matter. So now you want to give them, throw on top of that, you know, domestic terrorists, Black identity extremists, and all the rest. No, no, no.
Yeah, I mean, and there's another element, and we're going to jump to questions around this, how, of course, race is a predominant dynamic within this whole institution of the prison. Well, the way that language racializes, right? If you say terrorists, and then you add domestic, you're saying domestic equals white, and then you're saying the default for terrorist is a racialized Muslim. So there are things that we have to contend with if we don't want to reproduce prisons, right? And so again, we have some questions coming in. Are you all ready for them? From YouTube listener Natasha Bidhan, please correct me, it says Alan Burnett. Sorry, this is somebody that's part of the team that wrote this. So Alan Burnett says, what are some of the work that these former life without parole men are doing in their communities?
Well, Alan is actually a member of our program and a star. He's one of those life without parole who is just doing incredible things. And so some of the work, I mean, Alan, for example, is doing a lot of work with Human Rights Watch, and you know, he's a great example of one of those people that is, once you meet him, he, you know, changes people's minds, but he's smart enough as well to be advocating for, again, I don't know what the right word is, because it's not really abolition and it's not really reform, but advocating for those who are incarcerated, essentially, in whatever way he can, in whatever space he can. So he is someone that's doing remarkable things in those ways. Tobias Tubbs is another former life without parole prisoner who is doing tremendous things in South LA with urban gardening program, and he's also one of the guys that's heading up this kind of restorative, transformative storytelling project in South LA. So I think we have Anthony McDuffie as well, who and Janae Quinney, both former gang members from different sides, one a Blood, one a Crip, who are doing a lot of work around reducing gang violence amongst teenagers in South LA. And Janae Quinney did a lot of work as well during COVID, feeding the community, started a food bank in West Athens community. So they've been doing tremendous things. I could go on, but those are some of the ones that spring to mind.
Thank you so much for that. You also reminded me that I did have a question for Jody that's kind of on this piece of what's happening now. Jody, your book is about to come out.
It's already out.
It's already out. Okay.
It's been out for a little while. We've had a good run.
Okay, where's my copy? Can you tell us a little bit more about this multimedia project, and if it's where we can see it, or if it's live performance?
Yeah. Well, the book really at the heart of my book was this play idea, Race, Rap, and Redemption, and it was in the play I asked, should we? I put it on in Bovard Auditorium, which holds around 1,100 students and staff and faculty in the heart of USC. And the call of the question for the evening for the students, assembled students, faculty, and staff was, should we collectively pour liquor for Tukey? Stanley Tukey Williams had just been put to death after Arnold Schwarzenegger denied his petition for a stay on the explicit ground in his denial letter that Tukey Williams had not achieved personal redemption. That was the legal criterion he applied at the time. And so that was my call of the question. Should we, in other words, as a collective unit, engage in a ritualistic, ceremonial expression of solidarity and empathy and sympathy with a first-degree murderer named Stanley Tukey Williams, who co-founded the Crips, right? I didn't want to talk about low-level nonviolent drug offenders of the kind that Michelle Alexander centers her book, The New Jim Crow, on, because as John Pfaff points out in his book, Locked In, only 5 to 6% of the prisoners in the state prison system, which is where 87% of the prisoners reside, are there for anything that could be characterized as a low-level nonviolent offense, or let alone low-level nonviolent drug offense. And that's probably an inflated number, all right? So if we really want to do something about racialized mass incarceration, we're going to have to radically overhaul how we think about violent offenders, especially violent Black offenders. So I wanted to center the play on a violent Black offender named Stanley Tukey Williams, and make this closing argument for the damned in front of and make the audience, the jurors. And I knew that if I was going to change hearts and minds and bring them around to sympathetically identifying with a Stanley Tukey Williams, I wasn't going to be able to do it just using propositional content of the kind the lawyers are trained to use, right? Just a lot of, formal arguments and, fancy language and this way or that way. Argumentation is important and vital, of course. But it wasn't going to be sufficient in 2.5 hours to get us to pour liquor for Stanley Tukey Williams. I knew I was going to have to bring in the arts, the performing arts, because arts are a way to people's hearts and minds in combination, I think, especially with some propositional content like nothing else. So I made essentially my closing argument basically a kind of a statement followed by an exhibit, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and each exhibit was a performance. Like Lula Washington's dance company doing a modern dance to Tupac Shakur's Brenda's Got a Baby. About a 12-year-old girl who is raped and has a child, and community turns their back on her. The closing couplet is, prostitute found slain and Brenda's her name, she had a baby. Then we asked, what if that baby Brenda had was Stanley Tukey Williams? And he comes out and he winds up in the foster system now. And the story we just shared about hurt people hurting people, we go, right? And so, then there were other performances like that. Maytha Alhassen, Saul Williams, culminating in performances by Ice Cube and others. And by the end of the night, what I saw was the power of art, because what I saw was, and you see in the footage, almost 1,100 students, staff, and faculty standing up with their lighters in the air for Stanley Tukey Williams, right? Because that's the power of art. So that's Maytha, that's what so I try to build on some insights from that play to talk more about how we can humanize criminals, especially violent criminals, especially violent Black criminals, through the arts. And now how we have to humanize them if we're ever going to make real deep cuts in racialized mass incarceration.
Yeah. So again, let's have somebody sponsor a redo of that so that we can see it in the post-pandemic world together. That sounds incredible. But I think what you're gesturing towards is that the power of art is indisputable and it's transformative. It's part of all our work. So we have a question about that from Ann Cantor. So also please continue to send in your questions. We only have 20 minutes left for questions. So Ann Cantor says, can you give examples of some positive collaborations with California literary community in LA and beyond? How best to educate writers and readers about the need for decarceration? So it sounds like we're talking about both inside, outside. I mean, there's also a program called Inside Outside Writers, but anybody can go into that.
Sorry, so the question is how to educate writers.
Well, it says both collaborations with the literary community and how to educate writers. It sounds like, I don't know, maybe they're talking about it inside, outside, but you could take the question any way you want.
Okay, well, I mean, I would say with the response to the collaborations, you know, I mean, I was thinking about, I think about this a lot, like what does writing do when the experience of it, and how does it include your body? How does it do all these kind of things to you when you write and you can articulate these ideas and feel, oh, that's what I meant. So if you can collaborate with incarcerated writers and help promote that experience and help, you know, share their words, I think it's less about writing about someone and than as much as like trying to collaborate in the real sense of the word, and allow people's voice to come out and think what that really must feel like if you are been essentially thrown away. I mean, Alan, who was asked the earlier question, was telling me about, you know, being in solitary confinement in Pelican Bay and having these moments where he tried to put language to this transformation that he wanted to see in himself and he wanted to see to the prison system. And years later, he's now doing that and being able to do that. So I think when you really kind of not take for granted what language can do, and particularly for people that have maybe had bad experiences with it in the school system or something like that, to be able to kind of offer those opportunities is really a way that I would hope all writers could search out possibilities. And there are a lot of programs out there, including WordsUncaged, which we would be welcome anyone that wants to, you know, collaborate on these issues.
Jody, do you have any? Thank you for that, Bidhan. Do you have any examples?
You know, just a lot of the similar kinds of experiences. I'm thinking of, you know, how much we talk about words that wound, why we need hate speech codes. People say, you know, people are using words that wound. We don't talk enough sometimes about words that heal, and how words can also heal, how words can suture the places where blood flows from the words that wound.
Right.
So I've just seen that, happen just over and over. You know, Toni Morrison says, you know, reading is meditation. And that, I think a lot, and I think writing is too. And I think a lot of my best students, my favorite students through the years, you know, have made me a better writer, have made me a better meditator.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I love that. You know, if I can offer something, and one of the exercises I do with folks is kind of taken out of the book of one of my mentors, Robin D.G. Kelley, who talks about freedom dreaming. He has a gorgeous introduction. You can find it online. You should buy his book, though. You should buy everybody's book here. And then he has this gorgeous epilogue about what it would look like to live out his freedom dream. So I ask people, and I think this is something similar, Bidhan, that you've talked about. What does it look like to be free? What does freedom look like? What does it feel like? Because we've been it has been a disembodied experience, right? Where we've gotten to the point that we could say it's okay to put bars in front of people and to be in solitary confinement. And I mean, can't even imagine what's happening in COVID right now. So what would you want for somebody else in terms of the freedom that you want for yourself? So yeah, oh, we got some questions coming in. Okay, this one, David Hilsaback says, it strikes me that all three of you are pretty much talking about incarcerated men. How are incarcerated women even more marginalized, less worthy of our attention?
Well, we're just starting a degree in the women's prison. It all got delayed because of COVID. So my experience in women's prison is considerably less than the male prison. So, but I think you're right. There's a kind of, I mean, one of the things that struck me from my experiences in women's prisons is what we were talking about earlier, and this idea of harm and committing crime. So many women that are incarcerated for really long sentences around, murder and things like that, were horribly abused in a very direct way that led to it. They were being pimped or trafficked or stuff like that, or maybe, domestic abuse and things like that. And then the kind of bit that snapped them into, doing a violent act, it just makes that distinction we were talking about earlier between, this idea that there are violent criminals and that somehow it's like part of them, and then there are victims of violent crime. Just totally, it just blows that away totally in a way that was just very visceral for me and very immediate, because you see it right there. Like, I was being abused, I was being beaten, I was done this, I was being trafficked, and then I snapped and murdered this person that was doing this to me. And somehow there's no mechanism in our system to kind of, I'm not sure of the law, and Jody can correct me on this, but there's no mechanism to recognize that, and there's no mechanism to allow any kind of healing, because you've gone from being abused to being punished with no other opportunities in there. That in a way the female prisons just sort of they just bring it to a very sharp point that it's impossible not to think this is ridiculous. There's got to be a better way than doing this.
Also, the fastest growing prison population is women, correct? Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, they are. And there are some jurisdictions that have started in the last couple decades to recognize the claims of battered women in self-defense cases. So it used to be that if a woman killed a person, an abusive partner, while there was a lull in the violence, while he was asleep, or perhaps even by getting somebody else to kill him, that she could not claim self-defense. They say you can't claim self-defense because to claim self-defense, there has to be no less drastic alternative. And since he was asleep, you could have left the house and gone to the police, and they could have taken you to a battered women's shelter. And so you didn't have to do it for that reason. Number one, right? They were saying that. And then number two, the threat wasn't imminent. He was asleep, so it wasn't imminent. You have to be under attack. But the law has changed. Number one, in a number of jurisdictions, not nearly enough. But in some jurisdictions, because of a long campaign by people who have been seeking important criminal justice reform that balances the scales in terms of gender more, you have experts who get on the stand and tell jurors about battered women syndrome and how not only is it something that can affect someone's, say, psychological capacity to, leave the situation, learn helplessness and that sort of thing, although some people go down that road. I think the more interesting testimony that they bring out is how, we don't have to go down, she was cognitively challenged. There was no less drastic alternative. Police do not protect these women. Battered women's shelters do not work. They bring the ghost of dead women into the courtroom and sit them down in the witness box with them as they describe separation assault resulting time after time in death by these women who are trying to lead these men, right? So they say, no, you can't just walk away. And you're saying he's sleeping doesn't pose a threat. You're telling me that if somebody abducts me and, they say they're going to kill me when they awaken, I have to wait till they wake up, before I take them out, or something like that. So it's changing slowly, but we still got a long way to go.
Yeah, it just made me think of a couple of cases that became pretty massive. The Centonia Brown story, teenager who was attacked, was sex trafficked, was attacked by somebody who was propositioning her, and she killed him in response as self-defense. And she was granted clemency because there was a public outrage against it. And another story that was revisited, but at the time she never got any redemption around it, was Lorena Bobbitt. I don't know if folks saw that documentary series that they did. I think it was Underwatch, but basically it was a comedic story, and this guy who was a terrible abuser, and we never heard that part of the story, was seen as having something taken away from him, and he was the victim of that story, but she was undocumented. She relied on him. She was constantly abused, and she was to her breaking point. And there was nobody, especially in the 90s, that was protecting her. Highly recommend both stories to go revisit the nuances of the story of women within the prison system. A last question we have, unless folks in these final minutes want to ask their question, is from Jonathan Shelley. And Jonathan asks, are there particular texts or readings that you have found to work well for the programming that you do?
There's, sort of the obvious ones, Foucault and stuff like that. But there was a book I read relatively recently called America is the Prison, about the kind of heyday of the Black arts movements in prisons mainly in New York, but also in California, in Soledad and stuff. Kind of the 1970s period, and then the history of even some of the degree programs. I didn't realize how many degree programs in prison there were until the Pell Grant funding got taken away. There was something like 300 programs in the country, and kind of reading that history, you realize that there was this moment where a lot of the stuff we were talking about was almost coming to some kind of fruition. In some ways, that there were programs that were going into prison that weren't just teaching about like personal responsibility or stuff like that, but were teaching about liberation in this bigger sense, this social sense that we're talking about, and that there would the idea of these education instead of just punishment with, warehousing kind of thing, and how abrupt that change was, in the kind of late 80s, early 90s. That was a very powerful book for me. I forget the guy's first name, but Bernstein is his last name, and the book was America is the Prison.
Thank you. Jody, do you have any recommendations?
Well, one of the forms of literature I think often is overlooked that I draw on in all my work is rap. I'm thinking, the people I draw especially on are people like Tupac, Pac, Nas, Cube, even Hove. And what I found is when we're working on word work, and the people in the class, whether they're prisoners or my students or both, typically both, when we start thinking about language and how we're going to perform the language, and make an art in the art of language, it's, and they're listening to people, they start listening to people. A lot of them have always been listening to him this way, but they start listening to people like Tupac, for his language skills. and then connecting what they hear with him, what he's doing with the language to, then I'll bring in one of my favorite writers, Melville, and here comes, I'm tormented by an everlasting itch for things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous coasts. I mean, we start getting into it. They see, here he is over here, and he's flowing like, I hear Cube flowing over here, or just like Hove in, Magna Carta over here. And it really presents some nice bridges. And a lot of the good rappers are really making a lot of very nice, literary references that makes it possible to bring in a whole lot of literary traditions, and they hear some great stuff. And so, yeah, that's kind of been, I found, a very helpful tool.
So you've been requested, Jody, to hold up and recommend your book.
Yes, here we go.
It's this is from Larb. It's a seminal work on some of the subjects we were discussing. Wow.
There you go. How about that? How about that?
So I also have another amendment to make. David Hilseback is Reverend David Hilseback, who performed the burial service for is it Robert Harris? I just got this message. Related to this question, I'm curious, do you have any, besides programming, any books that if folks want to, enhance their own pedagogy to learn about the work that you're doing besides your books, any other books you would recommend, or writers or authors in this world?
Yes, well, I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the Words Uncaged books. So Alan, who had the earlier question, he is featured in a book we produced called Human, and that's available for free on our Words Uncaged website. You can just read the PDF. And then we have an art book that just came out relatively recently called 128G, which is the kind of institutional term for someone's history. So it's kind of a reclaiming of that institutional reduction of your history on a form and through art. So that's also available through our website, WordsUncaged.org. And then we have another book, Disconnected, Reconnected, which is again also available through our website or links to Amazon. And all of those are predominantly life without parole writers.
Thank you for that. We have a couple closing questions before we turn this over to LA Review of Books. So one I'm sure we're all familiar with asks, if we abolish prisons, do you think there's another type of punishment that might replace them? And if so, what form of do you think that punishment might take? So
yeah, well, in the short term, for sure. See, this is what makes it tough for a lot of folks. In the short term, you're telling us that we don't want some legal consequence, some significant criminal consequence for Derek Chauvin. Okay, now are we okay? Abolitionists, stand up. So all those who say, for what Derek Chauvin did, there should be no penal consequence at all, zero. And we'll make sure that every police officer out there gets that signal for future cases, that there will be no consequence, zero, of a penal nature, right? We start, I think many of us start to balk and hesitate. And I think that certainly a lot of people in the Black community that I talk to right now are saying, like any other community, we want killing solved. We want rape solved. We don't want rape kit backlogs. We want violent offense. We want to be able to walk down the street and have our children walk down the street with some sense of safety, like other communities. That's an important public good. And so what our problem is with the police only dedicating 5% of their time to responding to violent offenses or calls of any kind, that there's not spending time really solving violent crimes. Instead, they're spending time going after turnstile jumpers and broken windows policing and a lot of other stuff, traffic enforcement stuff that they don't need to be doing anyway, mental health stuff and drug interdiction stuff and houselessness stuff and homelessness stuff, all that stuff. They need to be focusing on solving the serious violent crimes in the Black community. And many would say, now, what are we going to do? That doesn't mean that then you try to make the punishment for those criminals be as grim and torturous as possible. It means that and the way that Bidhan was talking about earlier, you look at the prison conditions in some of these European countries, and they're just very different. The prison conditions themselves, some of them are more like dorm rooms. We need to treat people like human beings, and like we're trying to rehabilitate them. So yeah, we got to get them off the street. You got to stop the rapes and murders. You got to stop them. You got to get the offenders off the street. And meaning incapacitation. That means we can't have abolition overnight. We all understand that. But once we have incapacitated them so that they're not causing harm, we can treat them humanely, try to rehabilitate them, treat them with the basic human decency and respect.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's a really good characterization of this transitory period that we're trying to figure our way through as we try to divest the over 50% that is invested in policing and so much more, not so much more, but even more than just 50% altogether around the prison industrial complex that includes the prison from our tax dollars. How do we transition from the divestment of some of that to community solutions? So appreciate that. Another amendment to an amendment, David Hilsaback is Reverend Polly Hilsaback was a priest at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Apologies for that. Before we go, is there any way that people can continue to follow you and your work or the work that you are championing? Please let us know.
Bidhan?
Yes. You can follow Words Uncaged on Instagram or, wordsuncaged.org as well. And, hopefully when the pandemic's over, we do host a lot of different events and things like that. So there's numerous ways to get involved, but please, stay in contact. And if you are interested in collaborating in some capacity, there are always opportunities down the line.
JodyArmour.com. I had to look up my own.
I was just gonna say, did you just look it up?
JodyArmour.com. I have to make sure. I hate to admit it. Is my Twitter handle is named after my latest book. It's at Nigga Theory, Nigga Theory, without the asterisk on that occasion. And then, of course, LARB books. Yeah, amazing. I just want to say one of the first times I met Jody, he was saying, the more radical I get, the bigger my fro gets. So it's good to see that you still are at your most radical at heart. So I appreciate that. And it was so great to meet Bidhan. We have so many circles that intersect. I can't wait post-pandemic to connect with you and to do more. So thank you all. Thank you, LARB and Irene, Sonia, Boris, the whole team that I have yet to meet. Thank you again. Thank you, Maytha.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Maytha, Bidhan, and Jody for this terrific conversation, and to all of you for joining us and sharing such thoughtful and really thought-provoking questions. We also want to thank our Matching Grant 2020 event donors, Ron Arias, Laura Donnelly, Kieran Satia, Jenny Williams, and Joan Hennahan, for helping to make this evening possible, and to everyone here who donated to the workshop scholarship fund through this event. If you'd like to learn more about the LARB Publishing Workshop, while we're also dropping lots of links and things in the chat, you can find us at thepublishingworkshop.com. And if you'd still like to donate, we invite you to do so there or through the link that'll be appearing in the chat. If you enjoyed this event and would like to know more about other events that LARG will be hosting this year, hopefully without the technical difficulties as we mark our 10-year anniversary, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already, or find us at lareviewofbooks.org. Thank you all so much again. Thank you to our wonderful speakers for joining us, and we wish you all a wonderful evening.
Bye, thank you.